Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband put spyware on my phone. He read my every message, but he never knew I discovered it on the very first day. For 3 months, I played along. When he came to court with divorce papers, the judge was already holding. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me what our marriage looked like from the outside, and honestly, it looked perfect. That was the problem. My name is Claire Hendricks, and for 11 years, I was Marcus Hendricks's wife. We lived in a pale yellow colonial house on Sycamore Lane in Naperville, Illinois. The kind of street where neighbors wave from their driveways, and somebody always has a casserole ready for a bad day. We had 2 kids, Lily, 9, and Owen, 6. I worked part-time as a medical billing specialist from home, and Marcus ran project operations for a mid-size logistics company downtown. We had date nights on Fridays. We argued about whose turn it was to call the plumber. We were ordinary in all the ways that feel safe. I loved him. I want to be honest about that, because what came later doesn't erase what came before. I loved the man who used to bring me coffee before I even got out of bed, who remembered that I hated cilantro, who slow danced with me in the kitchen on New Year's Eve when the kids were already asleep. That man was real. He existed. What I didn't know was that somewhere along the way, he had decided that love and control were the same thing. The first sign came on a Tuesday in February. I remember because it was Lily's school picture day, and I was running late, stuffing Owen's lunch into his bag with one hand and scrolling through my phone with the other, looking for the permission slip I'd photographed the week before. I opened my photos and noticed something odd. A folder I didn't remember creating. It was buried, unnamed, containing only a single screenshot of my text conversation with my friend Dana. The screenshot was taken at 11:47 p.m. the previous Thursday. I had been asleep by 10. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, cereal box in hand, children arguing behind me, and felt something cold move through my chest. Then I told myself it was a glitch. Phones do strange things. I closed the folder and drove my kids to school. But I am not the kind of woman who forgets. Over the following days, I started noticing small things that I'd been unconsciously filing away for weeks. Marcus knew about conversations I'd had with Dana that I'd never mentioned to him. Offhand references, small jokes he'd repeat back to me slightly rephrased as if they were his own observations. He asked why I'd seemed interested in a divorce attorney's website, though I had only Googled the name because Dana was having her own marital problems and asked me to look someone up. I had never told Marcus that. I had texted Dana the name. That was all. I started paying attention. I didn't confront him. Confrontation felt dangerous in a way I couldn't yet name. Not because Marcus had ever been physically threatening, but because I understood instinctively that if he knew I was suspicious, whatever advantage I had would vanish. So I smiled. I made dinner. I helped Owen with his reading homework and braided Lily's hair and acted like everything in my world was exactly as it always had been. Meanwhile, I began researching. It took me less than 4 hours to find it. He had installed a monitoring application on my phone, a commercial spyware product marketed absurdly as a family safety tool. It was running silently in the background, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. It mirrored my texts, my emails, my browser history, my location, and my call logs in real time to an account only he could access. I found this on a Wednesday evening, sitting in my car in the garage after the kids were in bed, the engine off, the house lights glowing orange through the door window. I remember staring at my own reflection in the dark windshield and feeling something shift inside me. Not panic, not rage. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. He had been reading every message I sent, every search I made, every private thought I'd trusted to a screen. For how long, I didn't yet know. But I knew this. He didn't know that I knew. And that meant I still had something. The papers came 3 months later. I'll get to that. I'll get to the moment Marcus walked into our kitchen with a manila envelope and a lawyer's card, looking like a man who had already won. I'll get to what the judge was holding when Marcus tried to speak. But first, you need to understand what those 3 months looked like. Because I didn't fall apart. I didn't confront him. I didn't pack a bag or call my mother or do any of the things that would have been reasonable and understandable and completely, utterly wrong. I made a plan. I sat in that car for a long time. The garage smelled like motor oil and old cardboard. We'd been meaning to clean it out since October. The kids' bikes were hanging on the wall. Lily's was purple with a white basket. Owen's had a Batman sticker peeling off the frame. I stared at those bikes, and I made myself breathe slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're trying not to shatter in a place where shattering would be inconvenient. What do you do when you realize the person who shares your bed has turned your own phone into a surveillance device? You count what you stand to lose. That's what you do first. Before the anger, before the plan, before anything else, you make yourself look clearly at the stakes because that's the only way to fight without making mistakes. I lost my marriage the moment I found that app. I understood that with total clarity, sitting in the dark of that garage. Whatever version of us I had been trying to preserve, through his moods, his jealousies, his habit of questioning everything I did without ever directly accusing me of anything, that version was already gone. What remained was a legal and financial situation, 2 children who needed a stable home, and a man who had demonstrated that he was willing to secretly monitor his own wife rather than simply talk to her. The fear came after the accounting, and it was real. Marcus earned nearly twice what I did. He had existing relationships with 2 attorneys. I'd heard him mention them at dinner parties, the casual comfort of men who keep lawyers the way other people keep accountants. I worked part-time. My name was on our joint account, but I had no separate savings. We had equity in the house, retirement accounts, a timeshare in Florida I'd always hated. In a divorce, everything would become a negotiation. And Marcus, I now understood, had been preparing for that negotiation while I'd still believed we were a team. How long had he been reading my messages? Weeks? Months? Had he been building a case against me while I'd been planning Lily's birthday party and worrying about Owen's stutter? I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and told myself, stop. Panic is information you already have. Use it. Don't drown in it. I went inside. I made myself a cup of tea. Marcus was watching television in the living room, and he looked up and smiled at me. The easy, familiar smile of a man who had no idea his plan had already been compromised. And I smiled back and asked if he wanted anything from the kitchen. He said no. He turned back to the screen. I went upstairs and lay in the dark and began to think. The first decision I made was the most important one. I would not remove the spyware from my phone. Taking it off would alert him. More critically, it would eliminate my leverage. As long as the app was running, I controlled exactly what he saw. My phone was no longer just my phone. It was a stage, and I could choose what performance to give. The second decision followed from the first. Everything real would move elsewhere. The following morning, I drove to a Target 2 towns over and paid cash for a prepaid smartphone. A cheap Android, nothing remarkable. I activated it under a different email address I created on the store's Wi-Fi using a name that meant nothing. That phone became my real phone. The one Marcus was monitoring became my prop. The third decision was harder. I needed a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but one who had experience with exactly this kind of case. Covert surveillance within a marriage, digital evidence, financial preparation for divorce. I needed someone who would not simply advise me to settle, who understood that what Marcus had done might constitute a violation of federal wiretapping statutes, not just a marital grievance. I called Dana from a parking lot using the prepaid phone and told her everything. Dana was quiet for almost 30 seconds. Then she said, "Claire, are you safe?" I told her I was, that he had never touched me, that this was a different kind of thing. "Okay," she said, "then we do this right." Dana worked in HR for a healthcare system and had spent years navigating complicated institutional conflicts. She was not easily rattled. She was also, as it turned out, the person who knew someone who knew a family law attorney named Patricia Okafor, a woman with a particular specialty in technology-facilitated abuse cases, with a record that made opposing counsel visibly uncomfortable. I had an appointment with Patricia within a week. I drove there in the middle of a Tuesday, told Marcus I was having the car serviced, and left my monitored phone at home. With a pre-typed text to Dana sitting in the drafts folder, something warm and mundane about a recipe, just in case he checked timestamps. I was beginning to understand the shape of what I was doing, and sitting in Patricia Okafor's clean, sunlit office in downtown Naperville, listening to her ask precise, unhurried questions, I felt the fear recede. Not disappear, but recede, pulled back by something steadier. I was not a victim waiting to be discovered. I was a woman with a plan. Patricia Okafor had a habit of writing things down by hand. In an age when every attorney I'd ever encountered typed notes on a laptop, she used a yellow legal pad and a black pen, and she wrote slowly and deliberately, as if each word deserved its full weight. I found that enormously reassuring. Our first meeting lasted 90 minutes. She listened to everything: the unnamed photo folder, the conversations Marcus had echoed back to me, the search about the divorce attorney, the moment I found the app itself. She did not express alarm or sympathy in the theatrical way that would have made me feel managed. She simply listened, wrote, and occasionally asked a question that revealed she had understood perfectly. When I finished, she set down her pen. "The application you found," she said. "Do you know the name of it?" I had written it down on a slip of paper. I slid it across her desk. She looked at it and nodded slightly. "This falls under the category of stalkerware, commercially available, marketed to parents and employers, but regularly used by intimate partners to monitor spouses without consent." She folded her hands. "In Illinois, intercepting private electronic communications without consent is a criminal offense under the Eavesdropping Act, in addition to potential federal liability under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. The fact that this is marital property and a shared household does not grant him legal access to your private communications." I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt the specific hollow weight of having a weapon confirmed to be real. You're glad it exists, and you're tired that you need it. Patricia laid out the first steps with the same unhurried precision. We would begin building a documented record immediately. I would capture evidence of the spyware's presence. She connected me with a digital forensics consultant she used regularly, a quiet man named Robert Chin, who worked out of an office in Lyle. I would take no financial action, make no unusual withdrawals, change nothing about my visible daily behavior. I would not retain an attorney of record yet. That filing would alert Marcus and start a clock we weren't ready to start. I was to be a ghost in my own life, present, Smiling, ordinary, invisible in every way that mattered. Robert Chin documented the spyware in a single 2-hour session, generating a forensic report that established its presence, its installation date, 13 months prior, I learned, which meant he'd been reading my messages for over a year, and its data transmission logs. 13 months. I had been surveilled through 2 of Lily's school years, through Owen's first loose tooth, through every conversation I'd ever had with my doctor, my mother, my best friend. The number sat in my chest like a stone. But here is where something shifted. In the 5th week after I found the app, Marcus began to change. Not dramatically. Nothing that would register to anyone who didn't know him deeply. But I knew him. The Friday dinners became slightly shorter. He asked once whether I'd been talking to anyone lately, phrased casually, watching me over the rim of his coffee cup. He started glancing at my phone when I set it down, which he'd never done openly before, because he hadn't needed to. He checked it remotely. Why would a man who had secret access to his wife's phone start watching her phone in person? Because something on the phone had changed. Not the spyware. That was still running. But my behavior had changed, and he could feel it without being able to identify it. I was feeding the monitored phone a careful, curated version of my life. Texts to Dana about the kids, a few mundane Google searches, a Pinterest board about spring gardening. Nothing alarming, nothing connected. But I was also, and this was the part I hadn't fully anticipated, showing him less. The texture of my communications had thinned, and on some unconscious level he felt it. He knew something was different. He just didn't know what. The direct proof came in the 6th week, and it came in the form of his own mistake. Marcus forwarded an email to himself, a screenshot of a text conversation between me and my mother from 8 weeks earlier, in which I had mentioned feeling disconnected from him lately. He sent it from the monitoring account to his personal email, and he did not realize that in doing so, on a night when he'd left himself logged into Gmail on the family laptop, that email sat visible in his sent folder for 11 minutes before he thought to close it. I was not supposed to be home. I'd told him I was picking up the kids from my mother's. I came back early. I walked past the open laptop on the kitchen counter to get a glass of water. I saw it in 2 seconds. I did not react. I got my water. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and sent a voice memo to myself on the prepaid phone, describing exactly what I had seen with the time and date, while the memory was fresh. Then I went back downstairs and started making dinner. There was no going back now. Not that there had been before, but now I had watched him use his weapon carelessly, and I had my own, and I knew exactly how this had to end. By week 8, Patricia and I had a structure, not a plan in the dramatic sense. No ambushes, no confrontations scripted for maximum impact. A legal structure. Documented evidence of the spyware, certified by Robert Chin's forensic report. A private financial audit of our joint accounts, conducted quietly through a forensic accountant Patricia recommended. A woman named Sandra Webb, who had a gift for finding things people believed they'd hidden. A record of Marcus's income, assets, and what Sandra gently called informal transfers. Small, recurring movements of money into an account I wasn't supposed to know about, totaling just over $40,000 over the preceding 2 years. He had been preparing for this longer than I had. The thought should have crushed me. Instead, it clarified something. This was not a marriage that had broken down. This was a marriage that had already been dismantled from one side while I'd been standing in it. My job now was to account for that correctly. The first official step came on a Thursday. Patricia filed a motion for discovery and sent a formal letter to Marcus's employer requesting records relevant to income verification as part of the pre-filing documentation process. It was a procedural step, not yet a lawsuit, but it required that his employer's HR department acknowledge receipt. And HR departments in logistics companies where everyone knows everyone are not always quiet about these things. Marcus found out on a Friday afternoon. I was in the kitchen when he came home. I heard the door close, not slam, but close with the deliberate quietness of a man controlling himself very carefully. He walked into the kitchen and put his keys on the counter and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger exactly. Something colder? "You talked to a lawyer," he said. It was not a question. I turned from the stove and looked at him steadily. "I think you should be more careful about what you leave open on shared computers," I said. The silence lasted several seconds. Then his expression changed. The control cracked slightly, and underneath it was something I recognized as fear. Not of me, exactly, but of the situation having moved without his permission. He had been the one with information. He had been the one reading my messages, tracking my location, building a picture of my life that I wasn't supposed to know he had. And now here I was, standing in his kitchen, and I'd just told him I knew about the laptop, which meant I might know how long I'd known, which meant he couldn't be certain what I'd done with that time. "Claire, the kids are at my mother's tonight," I said. "I think you should stay somewhere else." He didn't stay somewhere else that night, as it happened. He sat down at the kitchen table and spent 40 minutes trying various versions of the same conversation. I had misunderstood. He'd been worried about me. The app was for my safety. It was a mistake in judgment, but it came from love. Each version was calibrated differently. First reasonable, then remorseful, then briefly and dangerously accusatory. He mentioned Dana. He mentioned that he knew I'd been spending time talking about our marriage to outsiders. That last phrase told me everything. He'd been reading Dana's messages too, or rather, mine to Dana. For 13 months, I did not raise my voice. I sat across from him and said, "I want you to hear something very clearly, Marcus. Every conversation I've had on that phone is documented. Every message you read is logged. I have a forensic report with an installation date and a full transmission history. Whatever you say in the next few minutes, I need you to remember that." He went pale. He left that night. Not because I'd asked him to, but because he needed to make a phone call he didn't want me to hear. I watched his car back out of the driveway from the upstairs window. Then I sat down on the floor of our bedroom, leaned against the bed, and let myself feel it. Not triumph, not grief, but the specific, exhausted relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy and has finally been allowed to set it down for a moment. The following days were strange. Marcus did not disappear. He came back the next morning, civil and distant, moving through the house like a man walking on unfamiliar terrain. He did not mention the lawyer again. He did not mention the phone. He asked about the kids, about groceries, about nothing that mattered. I gave myself 4 days. I visited my mother, let Lily and Owen run in her backyard, ate her cooking, and slept more than I had in months. Dana drove out on Sunday, and we sat on my mother's porch and talked about nothing serious for 2 hours. And I laughed genuinely at least 3 times. It was the last quiet I'd have for a while. Marcus called me on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the kitchen confrontation, using a voice I recognized. The careful, measured tone he used in professional settings when he was managing a situation rather than living inside it. He said he wanted to have dinner, just the 2 of us, to talk. I said I'd think about it. He sent a follow-up text 30 minutes later, to my real phone, the monitored one, that said, "I know things have been hard. I'd like the chance to be honest with you." I photographed it with the prepaid phone for my records and sent him back a brief. "I'll let you know." Then I sat with my coffee and considered what he was doing. Because this was not reconciliation. Marcus did not do vulnerability. Not real vulnerability. Not the kind that cost something. When he said honest in that context, he meant, "I want to find out what you know so I can manage the parts you don't." He wanted to sit across from me over a plate of food at a restaurant we used to love, in public where I couldn't react, and test the boundaries of my knowledge. He wanted me to be the wife who was still a little bit afraid of upsetting things. The wife who might, if handled correctly, be talked back into the version of events that worked for him. What he didn't know was that I'd spent those 11 days doing something far more useful than worrying. Patricia and I had met twice. Sandra Webb had completed the first stage of the financial audit and delivered a report that was, as she put it with professional understatement, eventful. The 40,000 in informal transfers was only the beginning. There were also pension disbursements that had been quietly rerouted, and a credit line opened in my name, with my forged signature, as far as Sandra could determine, that had been drawn down to the limit and then minimally serviced for 19 months. The credit line. I had not known about it. It existed. My credit score had been quietly damaged, and I had not known. I made myself set that information aside for later because if I thought about it fully in that moment, I would not be able to do what needed doing, which was remain composed and functional. I set it aside, and I kept moving. The social support, when it came from an unexpected direction. Patricia mentioned, at the end of our second meeting, a support group that met on Thursday evenings at a community center in Aurora. Women who had experienced technology-facilitated domestic abuse, many of them in the middle of divorce proceedings. She said it carefully, not as a prescription, but as an option, and I almost declined out of the reflex that says, "That's not me. My situation isn't that serious. Other people have it worse." I went anyway. I went because Dana had moved to Portland for 3 months for work, and I was aware of the way isolation functions, how it lets a distorted version of reality become the only version, how it makes the other person's narrative fill the room. The group met in a room with folding chairs and bad fluorescent lighting and a coffee urn that had seen better years. There were 9 women the first evening I attended. A facilitator named Joanne, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the manner of someone who had heard many things and judged none of them. I did not talk much that first night. I listened. A woman named Renee, who taught middle school, described how her husband had used her location data to appear coincidentally everywhere she went for 3 months before she understood what was happening. A woman named Lupe described finding text conversations with her own children in her ex-husband's evidence folder, flagged and annotated. A woman whose name I never learned described the particular loneliness of feeling surveilled in a place that was supposed to be safe. I drove home afterward and sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Here is the thing no one tells you about being in a situation like this. You spend a great deal of energy arguing with yourself about whether it counts, whether it's bad enough to warrant the actions you're taking, whether you're overreacting, being dramatic, failing to see his side. That internal argument is exhausting, and it is also, I came to understand, part of the mechanism. A voice that sounds like your own conscience, but functions like a constraint. Sitting in those folding chairs on Thursday evenings, I lost that voice. Not because anyone told me what to think, but because I heard my own story reflected back in 9 different registers, and I stopped being able to argue that it wasn't real. Marcus texted again on Friday about dinner. I responded, Not right now. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk. He read it. I could see the receipts on the monitored phone and did not reply for 6 hours. Then, okay, he was waiting, watching, trying to figure out what shape I had become. Good, let him wait. They came on a Saturday. I say they because Marcus didn't come alone. He brought his mother. Barbara Hendricks arrived at my front door in a camel-colored coat and the expression she always wore when she was performing generosity. A soft, slightly sorrowful smile that said, "I'm here because I love you, and I'm so sorry it's come to this." She had always liked me in the measured way that mothers-in-law, like daughters-in-law, who keep good houses and don't ask inconvenient questions. I had spent 11 years being exactly that, and she had never once looked at me the way she was looking at me now, with the careful eyes of someone assessing damage. Marcus stood slightly behind her, which I found interesting. I let them in. I offered coffee. I was wearing jeans and a gray cardigan, and I had not hurried to answer the door. I had taken my time. We sat in the living room, the room I had repainted 3 years ago in a warm white that Marcus had initially disliked and then claimed to have always loved. Barbara began with family. She talked about Lily and Owen, how they needed stability, how children remember more than adults think, how the foundation of a family is something precious and irreplaceable once broken. She said all of this warmly, leaning slightly forward, her coffee cup held in both hands. I listened. I did not nod. Then she moved into the second register, Marcus's. How good our life had been. How much he regretted causing me pain. How his actions had come from a place of deep fear. He interjected here. "I was terrified of losing you, Claire." I wasn't thinking clearly. How a momentary lapse in judgment shouldn't define 15 years of a relationship. 11, I thought. We've been married 11 years. He said 15. I didn't correct him. Then came the third register, which was the real one. Barbara, very gently, very warmly, began to suggest that the legal route was destructive for everyone, that the children would be traumatized by proceedings, that the financial reality of divorce, she said this delicately, as though delivering medical news, would be very difficult for someone in my position. She mentioned my part-time income. She mentioned the house. She did not mention the $40,000 or the credit line. She mentioned, as a final grace note, that Marcus's attorney was very experienced. Was this a threat wrapped in cashmere, or was I imagining it? I let several seconds pass. Then I said, "Barbara, I appreciate you coming. I know it took effort. And I know you mean well." I paused. "But I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that. I'm not going to change course. And I think you should know that I have spent the last several weeks working with my attorney, and what she's found has been significant. If Marcus would like to discuss terms, his attorney can contact Patricia Okafor's office." I said Patricia's name clearly and with intention. I had mentioned it in a text on the monitored phone 2 days earlier, knowing Marcus would see it, so the name would not be unfamiliar. Barbara's expression shifted. Not dramatically. She was too composed for that. But something in the architecture of her face reorganized, and the warm sorrow became briefly, clearly, something else. Something harder. Marcus set his coffee down. "You're really going to do this?" "I'm already doing it," I said. He stood up. The effort of maintaining the reconciliation tone had apparently reached its limit, because what he said next was not measured at all. "You have no idea how badly this could go for you, Claire. You don't have the resources to fight this. You're going to spend everything you have and end up with nothing." I looked at him. "Or," he said quieter, "you can sit down and we can work this out like adults. No attorneys, no courts, just you and me." Barbara touched his arm. He stopped. Think about what's best for the kids, she said to me. Not warmly this time. I stood up, which meant it was time for them to leave. I walked to the front door and opened it. I did not say anything more. I held the door and waited. They left. Barbara did not look at me as she passed. Marcus paused in the doorway, and for a moment, his face was something I almost recognized. Not the controlled man, not the calculating one, but something younger and more frightened underneath. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my back against the door, and I felt it. A clean, cold edge of fear. He was right that he had more money and an experienced attorney. He was right that this could get very difficult, but he was wrong about what I had. He thought he knew what I had because he'd spent 13 months reading my messages. He didn't know about the prepaid phone. He didn't know about Robert Chin's forensic report. He didn't know about the credit line Sandra had found, documented, and attributed. He didn't know what was sitting in Patricia Okafor's file. The fear sharpened into something I can only describe as fuel. I picked up the prepaid phone and texted Patricia. They visited. I'm ready to accelerate the timeline. Her response came 6 minutes later. Good. Let's talk Monday. The hearing was on a Tuesday in May. Marcus had filed first. He beat me by 11 days, which had been his intention. Filing first looks like initiative. It can sometimes shape the framing. His attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had salt and pepper hair and a manner of practiced ease, clearly expected a straightforward dissolution proceeding. He expected a part-time employed wife, limited independent legal resources, and a compliant narrative about mutual irreconcilable differences. He had been working from outdated intelligence. Patricia filed our response 3 days later, and with it, she filed a motion, a formal complaint for violation of the Illinois Eavesdropping Act, citing 13 months of covert surveillance of my private electronic communications, text messages, emails, internet searches, GPS location data, without my consent, conducted through commercially available stalkerware installed on my personal device without my knowledge. Attached to the motion was Robert Chin's forensic report, 47 pages, which documented the spyware's installation date, its configuration, and a sampling of its transmission logs. Also attached, Sandra Webb's financial audit documenting the irregular account, the $41,000 in informal transfers, and the credit line opened in my name with what appeared to be a forged signature. Gerald Pruitt had 48 hours to review this before the preliminary hearing. I dressed carefully that Tuesday morning. Not formally. I didn't want to look like I was performing. Dark trousers, a navy blouse, flat shoes. My hair pulled back. I had slept well, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake in anxiety, and instead had fallen asleep by 10 and woken up calm, the way you feel sometimes after you've made a decision so large that the body simply accepts it and rests. Patricia met me in the courthouse lobby. She was carrying a navy leather folder and wearing glasses I hadn't seen before. She looked at me and said, "How are you feeling?" "Ready," I said. And I was. I was genuinely, completely ready in a way I had not been ready for anything in a long time. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Family court usually is. Judge Ellen Marbury presided, a woman in her late 50s with an attentive face and the specific patience of someone who has heard many people's worst days and learned to move through them efficiently. Marcus was already seated with Pruitt when I came in. He was wearing a dark suit, and he looked, I thought, like someone who has been well coached and is working very hard to appear unworried. He glanced at me when I entered and then looked forward. Barbara was in the gallery, 2 rows back. Our eyes met for a brief second. She looked away first. The preliminary hearing was procedural, which meant it should have been brief. Pruitt had expected to establish the basic framework, table the motions, set timelines. What he had not expected was for Patricia to request that the judge review the forensic documentation immediately, given its direct relevance to asset protection and the integrity of proceedings going forward. She made the argument calmly and thoroughly, and Judge Marbury agreed to receive the documents. What happens when a judge reads a 47-page forensic report in the middle of a preliminary hearing is that the room becomes very quiet. Judge Marbury read. She did not rush. Pruitt leaned toward Marcus and spoke in a low voice. Marcus nodded twice and then stopped nodding. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, moved to his thighs. I watched him make the small, involuntary adjustments of a man who is recalculating in real time. The slight shift of weight, the jaw that tightens, and then deliberately relaxes. He had walked into this room believing he held all the cards. He was now watching them being laid on the table by someone else. Did he understand yet how thoroughly the ground had shifted? I think he did, and I think the understanding arrived all at once, the way cold water does. The financial documents came next. Pruitt objected to their inclusion. Too early, improper foundation, procedural grounds. Patricia had anticipated each objection and addressed it with the deliberateness of someone who had been preparing for this specific moment for 3 months. Judge Marbury overruled Pruitt twice in 4 minutes. That was when I saw Marcus's composure actually fracture. It happened over the credit line. When Patricia presented Sandra's finding, the account in my name, the apparent forged signature, the drawn-down balance, and Judge Marbury looked up from the document and looked directly at Marcus. He said something his attorney had certainly told him not to say. He said quietly but audibly, "That was a joint decision." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. Judge Marbury set down the document. She looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the table. I looked at nothing in particular and kept my face very still because Patricia had told me, "Whatever happens, whatever you feel, the courtroom is not the place for it. Save it for later." I saved it. The preliminary hearing ran 40 minutes over schedule. When it concluded, Judge Marbury had not only received all of Patricia's documentation into the record, she had issued a temporary financial restraining order preventing any movement of joint assets, ordered full discovery of Marcus's financial accounts for the preceding 3 years, and referred the eavesdropping complaint to the state's attorney's office for review. In the corridor afterward, I saw Pruitt speaking to Marcus in a low, urgent tone, his hand on Marcus's arm, his face doing the thing attorneys' faces do when they are revising expectations downward rapidly. Marcus stood with his shoulders slightly forward, reduced in some way that had nothing to do with posture. The careful, controlled man I had lived with for 11 years looked, in that corridor, simply tired. Tired and caught, and running out of moves. Marcus saw me across the corridor. I held his gaze for a moment. I didn't smile. I turned and walked out of the building with Patricia, into the spring afternoon, and I exhaled slowly and completely for what felt like the first time in months. The weeks that followed the preliminary hearing were not quiet, but they had a different quality. The chaos was Marcus's, not mine. The state's attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the eavesdropping complaint within 3 weeks of the referral. I was interviewed once, briefly, by a calm woman named Agent Torres, who asked precise questions and took notes on a small notepad. Robert Chin's forensic report, she confirmed, was exactly the type of documentation they needed. The investigation would take several months to complete, she said. I should expect nothing dramatic in the short term. Pruitt filed a series of countermotions over the following weeks. Challenges to the admissibility of the forensic report, objections to the scope of the financial discovery order, a motion to have Sandra Webb's credentials reviewed. Patricia addressed each one. The counter-motions were not the moves of a man with a strong position. They were the moves of a man buying time while reassessing what kind of loss he was managing. The forged credit line was the breaking point. Sandra's documentation of it had been thorough. Timestamps on the application, a handwriting comparison, a standard procedure in these cases, that showed inconsistencies with my known signature samples and the fact that I had never received any documentation from the lender because the account had been registered to a different mailing address, a P.O. box Marcus had opened 6 months before the application. When Pruitt reviewed the full scope of Sandra's evidence in advance of the second hearing, he called Patricia directly. It was the first time opposing counsel had called her directly, rather than through formal filings. She told me about it with the careful neutrality she maintained even in good moments. "He wants to discuss terms," she said. "Out of court." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means he's telling his client that certain of his client's actions have created exposures that go beyond divorce proceedings. It meant Marcus was looking at potential criminal liability for the credit application on top of the eavesdropping complaint. It meant that continuing to fight the divorce in court would mean continued disclosure of evidence that was becoming, with each filing, more comprehensively damaging to him." The settlement conference happened on a Friday morning in Patricia's office. Gerald Pruitt attended without Marcus, which told me something. He was professional and efficient, and made no attempt to relitigate the things that could no longer be relitigated. The terms Patricia and I had spent 3 sessions preparing were the starting point. Pruitt pushed back on 3 items. Patricia held firm on 2 and made one small concession that she had built into the structure specifically as a concession, something that looked like a compromise and cost us nothing material. The terms, when finalized, the house was mine with its full equity. The joint accounts were split, with adjustments accounting for the informal transfers Marcus had made from them over the preceding 2 years. The retirement accounts were divided equitably under a qualified domestic relations order. The fraudulent credit line, now documented as such, was transferred to Marcus's liability. He would make restitution for the balance, which his own accounts would cover, with the remaining amount attached to his future income as a structured payment obligation. He received no claim on my income, current or future. Primary custody of Lily and Owen was granted to me. Marcus had visitation rights, standard schedule, subject to review. His visitation included no overnight travel without advance notice and court approval during the first year. A condition Judge Marbury granted given the documented pattern of deception. I signed on the second Thursday in July, sitting in Patricia's sunlit office with a cup of water at my elbow and the window open, the sounds of downtown Naperville drifting in. Patricia placed the final page in front of me and uncapped a pen and set it down. She didn't say anything. She understood that some moments don't need narrating. I signed. Walking out into the July afternoon, I stopped on the sidewalk. The street was ordinary. A coffee shop, a bank, a woman pushing a stroller. Nothing marking the moment as significant from the outside. The sun was exactly where the sun always is, at 2 in the afternoon in July. I had gone into that marriage with almost nothing of my own. No separate savings. No legal record of the financial contributions I'd made, no documentation of the 11 years of labor that had made Marcus's career possible by making our home function. I was leaving it with the house, the accounts, my credit restored, my children stable, and a legal record that told the truth about what had happened. Was it everything I'd lost? No. You don't get back the 13 months of private thoughts that someone else read without your knowledge. You don't get back the version of your marriage that turned out to be partially constructed. You don't get back the particular kind of trust that breaks this way. But you get something else, something harder and more permanent. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the windows up, and I allowed myself, finally, to cry. Not from grief, though grief was in it. From the specific, complicated relief of having fought a fair fight with unfair circumstances and won it cleanly. Then I dried my face, started the engine, and drove to pick up my kids. The first year after the divorce was the hardest and the best year of my life, and I say that knowing exactly how contradictory it sounds. We stayed in the house on Sycamore Lane. That had been important to me. Not out of sentimentality about the marriage, but because Lily was in the middle of third grade and Owen had just started first, and their teachers knew them. Their friends lived on nearby streets, and I had decided that what stability I could preserve, I would. I repainted the front door a deep green, which I had always wanted and never done. I planted a raised garden bed in the backyard that Lily helped me design, and that Owen cheerfully destroyed every third Saturday before helping me rebuild it. I learned that I was a capable gardener, and an even more capable person alone than I had been afraid of being. I went full-time at the billing firm that spring. The salary increase was not dramatic, but it was mine. Numbers I'd earned, a schedule I controlled, a professional relationship with my work that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. Within 8 months, I had built a small emergency fund, the first one I'd had in my own name in 11 years. It sat in an account Marcus had no knowledge of, and every time I checked the balance, I felt a quiet satisfaction that I'd not previously known money could produce. I also started doing something I hadn't done in years. I made decisions for myself without rehearsing how to explain them to someone else first. Small decisions at first, a different grocery store, a Saturday morning run, a book I'd been meaning to read for 4 years that Marcus had always called pretentious without opening. Then larger ones. I enrolled in a professional certification course that would qualify me for senior billing management roles. I said yes to things I'd previously declined because they didn't fit neatly into the shape my life had been required to take. I said no to things I'd previously accepted for the same reason. The freedom in that, in the simple exercise of ordinary preference without calculation, was something I hadn't known I'd been missing until I had it back. Lily and Owen adapted the way children adapt, imperfectly, with occasional sadness, and with the fundamental resilience that children have when the adults around them remain honest. I told them the truth in age-appropriate terms. I didn't speak badly of Marcus to them, not because I owed him that, but because they did. They were his children too, and how they understood him was their business to work out, not a weapon in mine. They saw him on his scheduled weekends, and they came home with drawings he'd made with them and stories about movies they'd watched. And I listened to all of it and asked questions. That was its own kind of freedom, choosing to be decent not because I had to, but because I could. Dana came back from Portland in September. She sat in my kitchen for 4 hours on a Sunday, and we went through 2 pots of coffee, and she made me tell her everything, slowly, from the beginning. At the end, she sat back and said, "You know what's remarkable about this? You never lost yourself." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I'm still thinking about it. I went back to the Thursday evening group in Aurora until November, then less regularly, and eventually not at all. Not because I stopped valuing it, but because I no longer needed it in the same way. I stayed in touch with Renee, who had finalized her own divorce and was, she told me, sleeping better than she had in 6 years. Marcus's story is not mine to tell in full. And I'll be honest, tracking his unraveling was something I had to make a conscious decision not to do. I chose not to follow it closely because, Watching someone you once loved fail is not the clean satisfaction people sometimes expect it to be. But certain things are simply part of the record. The state's attorney's office completed their investigation 11 months after the referral. Marcus was charged with 1 count under the Illinois Eavesdropping Act and 1 count related to the fraudulent credit application. His attorney negotiated the charges down. That is how these things often go, and I had been prepared for it. He received 18 months probation, a fine mandatory completion of a batterer's intervention program, which covers technology-facilitated abuse under Illinois law, and a permanent record of the conviction. His employer's HR department had been aware of the civil divorce proceedings and their implications since the income verification letter arrived the previous year. When the criminal charges became public record, they were less aware and more concerned. Marcus was placed on administrative leave pending review in the month the charges were filed. By the time the case resolved, he had negotiated a quiet separation from the company. His word, in the text he sent me, though I suspected his framing was doing considerable work. He moved into a rental apartment across town, and, as far as I could tell from the children's occasional incidental reports, spent a period of months in a state of reduced circumstances that had less to do with money than with the particular loneliness of a person who has lost the architecture they built around themselves. He had organized his life around control, of information, of narrative, of me. And without those structures, there was apparently very little left that he had built for its own sake. Barbara Hendricks sent me a card in October of that first year. It said, in handwriting that looked older than I remembered, "I hope the children are well." That was all. No acknowledgement of anything else. I put it in a drawer and eventually threw it away. I turned 41 the following March. I took Lily and Owen to the botanical garden, and we looked at the early spring flowers and ate ice cream on a bench in the pale sunlight. And I thought, this is the life. Not the dramatic version, not the story of what I survived, but this exact moment, on this exact bench, with the ordinary beauty of children I love in a world I'd fought to keep stable for them. This is what winning actually looks like. Control dressed up as love is still control. Surveillance dressed up as protection is still surveillance. And the moment you discover that someone has been reading your life like a document they own, that is not the moment you fall apart. What would you have done sitting in that dark garage holding a phone that wasn't really yours? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Your thoughts matter more than you know. And thank you genuinely for listening to the whole story.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.